We're going to talk a little bit about the future of storytelling. I might as well just ask the question, what do you think is the future of storytelling? That's the whole segment. You have 18 minutes to talk.
Oh, no.
In the beginning...
I think storytelling is getting really hot right now. It's hard to tell whether it's getting hot all across the country. I think it is. New York seems kind of like the hub of it. And the Moth has a lot to do with that, I feel. That people have loved the podcast. It's been very popular and has spawned a lot of sister shows and sister podcasts. And I think right now the kind of storytelling scene in New York, we are having discussions about what that's going to look like, because of the explosion. Like, what do we want storytelling to look like? What are the rules with storytelling when it comes to, like, how much is true and things like that. These are decisions that individual show producers make, but also I feel it's a bigger conversation with storytelling in general. My thinking, which is connected to my dissertation, my voice in that conversation has to do lately with more like being careful. Because of what I said earlier about the power of storytelling, I feel sometimes people get very excited about it, and this was me 4 years ago, right? You get very excited about it, you're in a rush to tell all of your stories and to get everyone else's stories without really thinking of some of the risks involved. So that's kind of the voice that I'm trying to be in that conversation.
Why do you think that that storytelling has become hot over the last couple of years in New York City and beyond?
I think, the guy who started the Moth, his name is George Doss Green, and he is a Georgian. He's a poet from the South, and he started it because when he moved up here, he realized in the 90s that nobody talked to each other in real ways, like they're all just running around having lunch with each other, and it's so rarely do they sit the way he used to with his friends in Georgia on a wraparound porch and just drink whiskey and tell stories until 2 a.m., And so he started the Moth in his living room to force people to sit and listen to each other tell long stories about their lives. And of course it blew up into what it is now with millions of people listening and slams across the country and in the education program and things like that. So I think part of it comes from the way that our culture is moving technologically. There's a lot of movement from the face to the screen, and I feel that the kind of long history that we have as humans of firelit type tales and the way we talked and communicated with each other for so long, and then on that timeline of how long we've been around, it's just a tiny hair's breadth of it has been the technological typing, right, and seeing things on screen. And I feel like we're evolutionarily wired to tell stories to each other, and we don't really do that in a lot of ways though in our like fast-paced city technological life. So we have this yearning that we can't quite identify, and then when we hear something like The Moth or go to a storytelling show, we're like, that's the thing I've been missing. Why is this so great? It's such a simple thing. Like, someone stands up and tells a story about their lives. Like, why is that so hot? Why did it take so long for us to figure out that that's a worthwhile thing to do with an evening? I don't know. I think it has to do with the way we communicate by text so often. We use it to expedite our lives and make things easier, but we also lose so much about that face-to-face communication.
So the podcast is very big. Do you have any thoughts, and you're talking about maybe the distinction between sound and screen, do you think there'd be something lost or gained by having like a video version of it?
No, I don't think anything's lost. I mean, The Moth also has a very popular YouTube channel, and so people watch videos of the stories, and to be clear, the Moth podcast came from the Moth live shows, so it's watching somebody tell a story that's really what the Moth is. If anything, there's something to be lost when you just take the audio. So no, I think it's even better if you get to see the person.
What do you think of the composition of the audiences? Is it young, old, a mixture?
Okay, it's total NPR crowd. If you go to a Moth show or any storytelling show in the city, everyone there knows what NPR is. Everybody loves This American Life. Everybody has a crush on Hourglass. Everybody, it's just, that's actually right now what I hope to push, right? I hope to push the edges of the population that's being drawn into storytelling. I feel like part of the Moth Shop community education program is that we're going into populations that don't listen to NPR and they don't know what the Moth is and they don't really care, right? So like a lot of times you show up to a group full of well-educated white people and you're like, I work for the Moth, and they're like, oh my god, I love the Moth. And then if you go to the schools that we're in, or the prisons that we're in, we're like, what the F is the Moth? Who cares? Right?
They're afraid of moths.
Well, they just the point being that this is awesome stuff, and the people who are seeking it out right now is a very specific population of generally well-educated, generally white, generally middle class or higher people. And I feel like bringing this stuff not only to others, but also like mining the natural resource that is, like, a lot of these working class people come from oral backgrounds, right? So like families who tell stories as part of their culture, but they're not the ones being put on NPR.
And so how do you invite them in to this conversation, to this storytelling world that seems, again, specific to a really, when you described it, a pretty narrow segment of society?
Well, it's what the Moth Shop Community Education Program is. We go into these populations that wouldn't otherwise find us. And we're like, hey, this is what we do. We think you'd be great at it. Let's teach you how to do it. And then we put on a showcase of their stories.
And how do you what's the relationship to getting into these communities?
Right now it's less streamlined than I think it should be and is going to be. Right now it's more just like there's one person in charge of the entire program, which is just too much responsibility. And he, people seek him out. So he'll get emails from maybe a teacher who works at a school who knows the Moth podcast and is like, please come in and work with my kids. Or, a nonprofit that works with a particular population and knows the Moth. So it's usually like one person from the population that I referred to, like that small population, who works with another population but knows the Moth and connects the two. What I think will eventually happen is that we'll have some sort of system to seek them out instead.
How do you find youth these days who are so technologically advanced respond to something so old school as a person getting up in front of them and talking?
It's not a hard sell, dude. They're hardwired. We are hardwired to tell stories and to listen to stories. It's not a hard sell at all. First thing you do is you tell a story to them. And they all listen. And they are all attentive. And they all have amazing things to say about your story and the choices you made as a storyteller. I think it's actually the easiest thing I've ever done as a teacher, is to get a kid interested in storytelling. Because it's natural. It's the stuff of first dates. It's the stuff of interviews. It's the stuff of dinner conversations. It's what we do anyway. It's just formalizing it.
There's always this weird distinction between curricular-based school activities and extracurricular, and this obviously feels more extracurricular. What do you think the role of stories are in K-12 education and properly written into a curriculum?
I know for myself, now that I've seen what it can do, that I can't imagine ever returning to the classroom without making this a part of my class. I know it's a tough sell when you're, particularly for schools that are, the kids are performing below grade level and the school has greater accountability for meeting things like state test standards and things like that. So I've definitely had conversations with principals that are like, we can't afford to give you 16 hours of instruction time. Like, that's not going to happen. And I hear them. I hear their argument. My argument is that your kids are probably underperforming because they don't care. They don't care enough. Or maybe they're not even coming, right? Relationships are the currency of instruction. If you can do something in your room that will allow kids to be more motivated, not only to be there, but to work harder for you, then it's worth it. It's worth the time you're doing. And so this work has the potential to increase student investment in the classroom, in the teacher, and in their classmates. And that is worth its weight in gold when it comes to getting them to work harder on other things.
Is there space currently in the English language arts curriculum, either in New York State, New York City, or Massachusetts, that has stories as a part of it?
Yeah, so both New York and Massachusetts are in the Common Core road, the Common Core state standards. So, and the work I do with the Moth actually applies to quite a few Common Core state standard things. Because again, of what we talked about earlier with the similarities between crafting an oral story and crafting a written one. So you have to make decisions about language and word choice and organization and details and things like that that are actually part of the Common Core.
Cool.
So that's another argument for why it was a worthwhile thing to do in class.
What do you think you can learn from doing stories that you couldn't learn from other forms of curriculum or subject matter?
the cheating answer is that you learn more about the people who are telling stories to you. Like, where else in the room would you find out that your teacher and her mom had a big fight when she was 16, right? Or that your buddy who sits next to you lost his brother when he was 6 or something like that. There are these things that you find out about each other that become the building blocks of trust between you, right? And the vulnerability creates that trust and that connection with someone. So that's cheating, clearly, because where else would you find out something like that unless you did a personality writing unit? But I think that's a worthwhile thing.
Kids these days are obviously like adults, really into technology. Are there advantages to having wired kids in terms of intermingling that with storytelling? Are they at odds? How do they relate, if at all?
I don't know if they're at odds so much. I think maybe the only thing that might be happening is that they're not used to. Sometimes they're not used to telling long stories, you know? Like, I remember when I was a kid, sitting in the hallway, you know, twirling the curly Q phone cord in my fingers and talking to my friends until midnight, just telling stories, you know? And now kids are just texting back and forth or Facebook messaging back and forth. Like, how often do they actually have real conversations with each other? And so in that sense, sometimes we might have a little bit of work to do to get them more comfortable doing that and listening to that. The listening piece, particularly. Like, sometimes it doesn't come naturally to kids who are always on their phones to stop looking at your GD phone for 5 minutes and just listen to someone. Like, that's sometimes a lesson that we have to teach them that maybe we wouldn't have in the 80s when I was a kid.
So again, you talked about before when we were off mic, about how Boston didn't have a slam when you were there, and now they do. Obviously, New York's grown. There's other Moth slams and other shows across the country. What do you think's going to happen with the Moth or other storytelling venues in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think it'll just get even bigger. It'll be huge. I mean, I feel like it's going to be. There seems to be some parallels between what's happening right now with the storytelling scene and what happened with stand-up comedy in the 80s. You know, like, it started off as this small kind of basement thing, again in New York, and people, it caught on and it started spreading, and then there were TV shows, and I feel like eventually, and maybe within 10, 15 years, there's going to be specials, HBO specials, or professional storytellers, things like that.
Cool. Awesome. So that was Christine talking about the future of storytelling.